Hollywood finished this movie by pasting a dead man's face onto his best friend's body, then sold it to us as a masterpiece. That is not a rumor. That is the post-production schedule. The Crow, 1994. The injuries on that lot started on day one and never really stopped. Then a prop gun killed the 28-year-old star 3 weeks before his wedding, and the machine still did not stop. Doubles, rewrites, one reel of film buried where nobody will ever see it. #1 opening built on a funeral. Forget the poster. Forget the soundtrack you loved. Here are 20 weird facts about The Crow, counting down to the strangest truth of all. Number 20. Day one ended with burned hands before a single frame of this movie mattered to anyone. The crew already had an injury on the books. The Crow began shooting in Wilmington, North Carolina, on a studio lot that had already hosted dozens of features. Day 1. Early hours. According to crew accounts given after the film's release, a piece of heavy equipment on the lot made contact with live power lines. A carpenter working nearby took the hit. He survived. He was badly burned, and he did not leave that day the way he arrived. Here is the thing about a set like this. It is a small city with a deadline. Cables everywhere, water everywhere, metal everywhere, and a schedule that bleeds money every hour it slips. On paper, an accident on day one is the moment a production stops and rechecks every single rig. That is not what happened. The area was cleared, the paperwork went in, and the call sheet for day 2 went out on time. 15 weeks were planned, most of them overnight, most of them under rain towers. The shoot kept its pace because the shoot had to keep its pace. Crew members later described that first accident as the moment the mood shifted. Not fear exactly, more like a quiet note in the back of everyone's head. Something on this job is not going to behave. When reporters later went hunting for a curse, this is where the timeline always begins. But there is nothing supernatural about a live wire and a tired crew in the dark. That is just the industry. Wet nights, long hours, heavy gear, tight money. The movie sold itself as gothic fantasy. The first blood on the job was ordinary, preventable, and completely real. Number 19. The comic was written in grief. The Crow did not start as a movie pitch. It started as a young man trying not to fall apart. James O'Barr was living in Detroit when his fiancée was killed by a drunk driver. He was in his late teens. He has said in interviews that he went into the Marines afterward and started drawing to keep the rage from eating him alive. Panel after panel of a dead man walking back into the world to settle accounts. He was not building a franchise. He was building a place to put the pain. The book came out through a small independent publisher at the end of the 1980s, and it moved through comic shops the way underground things do. Word of mouth. Photocopies. Kids who felt like nobody had ever drawn their exact mood before. Hollywood noticed late, which is usually how Hollywood notices. Here is the crazy part. O'Barr has said publicly that he took no comfort from the finished comic, and that after Brandon Lee died, he carried real guilt about it. In more than one interview over the years, he has said he wished he had never written the thing at all. Not because it failed. Because it worked. So the most famous grief comic of its era was made by a man who did not want it famous, adapted into a hit that he could barely look at. He built the story to survive one death. It became known worldwide for another. Number 18. The set that kept breaking by the middle of the shoot, the crew had stopped being surprised. The accident list around The Crow has been repeated for 30 years, and some of it is better documented than the rest. Reported incidents include a construction worker who drove a screwdriver through his own hand, a crew member who drove a car into part of the studio's workshop after a dispute, a storm that tore up standing sets, and fire on a production that used a lot of practical flame. Stunt performers took the usual hits and some unusual ones. Treat the full list as crew legend plus a real core. Not every retelling is verified. What is not in dispute is the pattern. This was an overnight shoot, in water, with heavy rigging, running long weeks, on a schedule nobody wanted to extend. And here is what fatigue does on a film set. It does not make people careless in the movie way, with someone yelling and storming off. It makes people faster. It shortens the second look. It turns a two-person check into a one-person check. Crew members joked about a curse, because joking is what you do at 4 a.m. in the rain when the fog machines will not start. The joke was easier than the real explanation, which is that everyone was exhausted and nobody had the authority to stop the clock. A cursed set sounds like a ghost story. A tired set is worse, because a tired set is normal. Number 17. The Stars Who Passed First Brandon Lee was not the industry's first answer for Eric Draven. By the reporting around the film's development, several bigger names of the era were circled, approached, or considered for the lead. Christian Slater, Johnny Depp, Charlie Sheen, and River Phoenix are the names that come up again and again in coverage of the project's search. Take that as widely reported rather than fully confirmed, because casting lists like this get repeated more often than they get checked. What is solid is what Brandon Lee wanted from it. He had come up through action work, including Showdown in Little Tokyo and Rapid Fire, and he was fighting a very specific box: son of Bruce Lee. Martial arts kid. Fists and nothing else. The Crow gave him a role with grief in it. Music, makeup, silence, damage. He talked about it as a doorway out of the box, and he pushed for it. And then, the coincidence nobody wanted. River Phoenix, one of the names attached to the search, died in October of 1993. The same year, Lee died in March. 2 young actors, 1 project's orbit, 1 terrible year. It is coincidence, not curse, and it should be said plainly rather than dressed up. Lee got the part that was supposed to make him more than his last name. It did exactly that in the worst possible way. Number 16. 15 weeks of rain and night almost nothing in this film was shot in daylight. And that decision shaped everything, including the danger. Director Alex Proyas wanted a city that never dries out. Wet asphalt, black sky, light bouncing off puddles like broken glass. To get it, the production ran night after night with rain towers pumping water over the sets, then repositioning, then doing it again. Actors soaked. Crew soaked. Cables in standing water, cold North Carolina nights that go straight through a jacket around 3 a.m. That kind of schedule flips a human being upside down. You sleep in daylight badly, you eat at strange hours, and by week 10 your reaction time is not what your paperwork says it is. Brandon Lee was doing heavy physical work in that soup, on wires, on rooftops, in makeup that had to be repaired constantly because the water kept taking it off. Here is the part that matters later. The look people still praise, that permanent midnight, was manufactured by a crew running on fumes. Every gorgeous frame in the finished film cost somebody a full night in cold water. And exhaustion is not a mood. On a set with weapons, rigging, and pyro, exhaustion is a safety condition. It is the environment in which a small procedural shortcut stops looking like a shortcut and starts looking like the plan. On screen it reads as poetry. On the ground it was 15 weeks of being wet, freezing, and behind. Number 15. The ratings board made them cut the version you have seen is not the version they shot. The Crow is built around a home invasion, an assault and a string of revenge killings, and in 1993 that meant a fight with the ratings board. By the reporting around the film, material had to be trimmed to secure an R rating rather than something harsher, with the attack on Shelly and several of the kill scenes taking the sharpest edits. Treat the specific list as reported rather than confirmed shot by shot, because studios rarely publish that ledger. Then the second round of cutting arrived, and it had nothing to do with the ratings board. After Brandon Lee was killed by a prop gun on set, gunplay in this particular movie carried a weight nobody had planned for. The people finishing the film had to think about what an audience could stand to watch, knowing what had happened. So the picture got leaner, more implication, less display. And strangely, that helped. The film suggests brutality more than it dwells on it, which is why it still plays as gothic instead of grotesque. But here is the twist that collectors still argue about. Some of that removed footage has never been restored in any release. The full uncut assembly is not a thing you can buy. It exists in a vault, in paperwork, in memory. The cuts were made for a rating. Then they were made again for grief. Number 14. Bai Ling's missing storyline one cast member. Bai Ling plays Micah, the occult-minded partner of the crime boss Top Dollar, played by Michael Wincott. In the finished film, she is striking and almost silent, a presence with very little runway. That was not the original design. By multiple accounts around the production, a larger strand of story built around Micah, her rituals and her hold over Top Dollar was shot and then reduced heavily in post. Why it happened is not mysterious. The film had to be reassembled after Lee's death, which meant the surviving footage of the lead had to be protected and stretched. When you rebuild a movie around what you still have of your star, the first material to go is the subplot that does not include him. That is not cruelty. That is arithmetic. And it was Bai Ling's English language debut. She had come out of China and into a big American genre production, and the version of the performance the public got is a fraction of what she filmed. Here's the crazy part. The trimmed strand is exactly what makes Top Dollar's world feel supernatural in the released cut. You feel a religion in that building without ever being told what it is, because most of the explanation is gone. She shot a whole character. The screen kept a rumor of one. Number 13. The 14-year-old who walked away the most memorable performance nobody built a career on belongs to a teenager. Rochelle Davis plays Sarah, the skateboarding kid who narrates the film and gives Eric his one human tether. She was around 14 when it was made. She is unpolished in the best way, and she is doing something almost no child performer of that era was asked to do. She is the emotional adult of the picture. Then Brandon Lee was killed during production, and a working set became the worst thing that has ever happened there. The people around her were adults with agents and therapists and next jobs. She was a kid on the payroll of a tragedy. Here is what makes it stick. In the years after, she did not build on the film. She stepped out of acting. In later interviews, she has spoken about the experience and about the industry with no nostalgia at all, and she has been open that the loss shaped how she saw the whole business. So the film that resurrected a dead man on screen produced one of the great teenage genre performances, and the performer looked at the wreckage and chose a different life. Every fan remembers Sarah's voice at the end. Almost nobody knows she never wanted the microphone again. Number 12. The soundtrack outran the film for a huge number of people. The Crow was heard before it was ever seen. The soundtrack is one of the great 90s assemblies. The Cure contributed Burn, written for the film. 9 Inch Nails covered Joy Division's Dead Souls. Stone Temple Pilots delivered Big Empty. Rage Against the Machine, the Jesus and Mary Chain, Helmet, and others filled it out. On-screen bands were real bands, with My Life with the Thrill Kill Cult performing in the club and the band Medicine appearing in the film as well. Graeme Revell scored the picture, and It Can't Rain All the Time, sung by Jane Siberry, gave the film its one line of comfort. Here's the crazy part. That album went to number 1 on the American album chart. A tie-in record for a comic book adaptation from a small distributor headed by a first-time-ish director outran most of the rock releases of its season, which means the film's reputation was built partly by kids who bought the cassette because of one song, then watched the movie later and got hit by the whole thing. And the album lasted. It became a doorway record, goth, industrial, grunge, all standing in one place at the exact moment those scenes were touching. The studio was nervous about the movie. The music got there first and refused to leave. Number 10. They built a broken city in North Carolina. The Gothic metropolis in this film is a stretch of the American South, in the rain, on purpose. The Crow was made at a large studio lot in Wilmington, North Carolina, which in that era was one of the busiest production hubs outside California. Cheap space, big stages, standing exteriors. The crew built city blocks there, then wet them down, then set parts of them on fire. Nothing connects to anything real, because nothing was real. Every street was assembled to be photographed from one direction, at night, under spray. Here's the part that got strange later. The studio behind the production, Carolco, was one of the great high-risk operations of its time, and within a couple of years, it was in financial collapse and bankruptcy. The lot outlived the company and changed hands, and Wilmington kept making film and television for decades. So the fake city survived, and the empire that hosted it did not. The sets got struck, repainted, reused for other shows. Pieces of that world went on to be somebody else's alley. The movie is about a man who comes back to a city that has already moved on. The set had the same fate. Number 9. The curse story people wanted the Lee curse is the most repeated claim about this film, and it is legend, not fact. Here is why it took hold. Bruce Lee died in 1973 at 32, with his film Game of Death unfinished. That picture was later completed using doubles, old footage and rewrites, and the seams show. 20 years later, his son Brandon died at 28, mid-production, and The Crow was completed using doubles, old footage and rewrites. Same family, same age bracket, same repair method. You can see why tabloids reached for the supernatural. But the Lee family has pushed back on the curse framing for decades, and for a good reason. A curse turns two preventable, specific tragedies into entertainment. Bruce Lee's death has a medical explanation. Brandon Lee's death has an equipment and procedure explanation. Neither one needed a ghost. Here's the genuinely chilling part, and it is not mystical at all. It is the industry's reflex. When a star dies with footage owed, the machine does the same thing it did in 1973. Find a double. Match the shoulders, recut around the face. Release 2 generations of the same family, both finished by other people's bodies. That is not a curse. That is a business practice, and it is worse. Number 8. The wedding 3 weeks away. The most painful fact about this movie is a date on a calendar. Brandon Lee was engaged to Eliza Hutton. Their wedding was set for the middle of April 1993 in Mexico. Plans were made. Family was coming. He was finishing the last stretch of the shoot first, then getting married, then starting the life the film was supposed to pay for. He was killed on the 31st of March, weeks out, and then read the script he was shooting. Eric Draven is a musician who is murdered the night before his wedding alongside the woman he was going to marry. That is the engine of the whole story. Lee spent his last working weeks playing a man robbed of a wedding while carrying invitations to his own. Nobody wrote that as irony. It was a coincidence in the plainest, most brutal sense, and it is the reason so many people cannot watch the film casually. When the character talks about being taken away from her, there is a second layer underneath that the filmmakers never intended and could not remove. He was buried in Seattle, beside his father. The movie is about a wedding that never happened. So is the making of it. Number 7. No weapons expert left on set. The worst detail is not the gun. It is who was not standing next to it. By the reporting and investigation coverage that followed Brandon Lee's death, the production had reached its final stretch, was working long overnight hours, and the crew handling firearms that night was not what it should have been. Accounts describe the specialist responsible for weapons having been released earlier and the revolver being handled by other crew rather than a dedicated expert on the floor at the moment of the take. That is the whole tragedy in one sentence. A gun on a film set is not dangerous because it is a gun. It is dangerous because it is a machine that requires one specific person whose entire job is to check it, hand it over, watch it, and take it back. Remove that person and you have not saved money. You have removed the brake. Here is what makes it unbearable. Everything else that night was routine. A dialogue scene. A doorway. A blank round, the kind of shot that gets filmed 1,000 times a year without a scratch. Investigators afterward focused on procedure, not villainy. No charges were brought. The finding was that people were tired, rushed, and under-supervised in the last days of a hard shoot. A44 killed him. An empty chair let it. Number 5. A grocery bag and a 44. The scene they were shooting was a flashback, and it was supposed to be simple. Eric Draven walks into his apartment carrying a bag of groceries and is shot by Funboy, played by Michael Massey. Standard coverage. Actor in a doorway, actor with a gun, blank round, effects rig, cut. The bag itself was part of the trick, the sort of practical setup a crew builds and forgets by lunch. Massey fired from close range on the take. The blank did what a blank does. The lodged bullet did what nobody knew was possible in that moment, and Brandon Lee was hit in the abdomen and went down. Here is the detail that haunts everyone who was there. For a beat, it looked like acting. He was supposed to fall. He fell. Reports from the set describe a delay before people understood that the performance had ended and the emergency had started, and on a big soundstage in the middle of the night, seconds like that are enormous. Then came the scramble. Medical call. Ambulance. A 28-year-old actor bleeding on a set built to look like a crime scene. And a camera was still running. That is the last quiet horror of it. The take existed. He walked through a doorway carrying groceries. It was the most ordinary shot in the entire movie. Number 4. 12 hours of surgery. He did not die on the set, and that is somehow worse. Brandon Lee was taken to the Regional Medical Center in Wilmington on the 31st of March, 1993. The wound was to the abdomen, and the internal damage and blood loss were severe. Surgeons worked on him for hours, reported at around 12, with transfusions running the whole time. Family and colleagues waited. He was pronounced dead that day. He was 28 years old. That window is the part people forget when the story gets flattened into one sentence about a prop gun. There were hours in which a room full of people were still fighting for a specific outcome, and a movie set a few miles away was standing frozen with its lights on. The official finding was an accident. The investigation looked at the ammunition, the weapon, and the procedures on the floor, and no criminal charges were brought against anyone involved. And here is the ugly practical truth that follows a death like this. Within days, the conversation had to become a business conversation. Insurance, footage owed, contracts, whether there was a film at all. The people closest to him were grieving while the machine started calculating. He finished almost an entire lead performance and never saw a frame of it cut together. The movie became immortal. The person did not get the chance. Number 3. The man who fired the blank there is a second casualty in this story, and he lived another 23 years with it. Michael Massey played Funboy. He pulled the trigger on the take because that is what the scene required and what the crew handed him. He had no way of knowing what was inside that barrel, and no reasonable actor would have. He was never charged with anything. Every account of that night places the failure in procedure and ammunition not in his hands. None of that helped him. In interviews over the following years, Massey spoke about nightmares, about stepping away from work for a long stretch afterward, and about the fact that he had never watched The Crow and did not intend to. He described being asked about it constantly by people who wanted the story, decade after decade, while he was trying to have an ordinary career. And he did keep working. Television, thrillers, character parts, big studio pictures. Audiences saw him for years without connecting the face to the worst night on a North Carolina soundstage. He died in 2016. The obituaries all led with the accident, which is exactly what he had spent his life not wanting. So the film has two men attached to one gunshot. One lost his life. The other lost the right to be known for anything else. He did his job on a take. The take followed him to the grave. Number 2. The family said finish at the movie only exists because the people with the most reason to bury it chose not to. After Brandon Lee's death, the production stopped and the film's future was genuinely in doubt. Coverage from the time describes the original studio distribution plan falling apart, with Paramount stepping away from the picture. What had been a summer release became an orphan with a dead lead and unfinished footage. The key decision was not a studio decision. By the accounts around the film, completing it went forward with the support of Lee's mother, Linda Lee Cadwell, and his fiancée, Eliza Hutton. They knew what the movie had meant to him. They knew it was the role that was supposed to end the typecasting. They let it be finished. Miramax's Dimension label picked up the picture, and the release was pushed to May of 1994, more than a year after the shooting. The finished film opened with a dedication to Brandon and Eliza. And here's the twist nobody in the industry expected. It opened at number 1. Not as a curiosity, as a hit. Reviews took it seriously, the soundtrack was already everywhere, and audiences who came for the tragedy stayed for the film, then came back. A studio ran from it. The grieving family did not. The most successful decision in this movie's history was made by two women in the worst month of their lives. Number 1. They rebuilt him from old footage. The strangest fact about The Crow is that its star is not fully in it. When Brandon Lee died, the shoot was near the end, with reports varying between roughly 3 and 8 days of work left. That still meant scenes existed on paper and not on film, including the apartment sequence he had been shooting when he was killed. So they rebuilt him. Chad Stahelski, Lee's friend and stunt double, stepped in for shots that needed a body in the frame, with other performers filling in as required. The effects house working on the film composited Lee's face from existing footage onto the double for shots like the walk through the apartment door. Elsewhere, the solution was staging. Rain, shadow, hoods, distance, doorways, reused takes and reverse angles that keep the camera off the face entirely. The script got surgery too. By multiple accounts, the flashback of Eric's murder was reworked so the death played out differently on screen rather than repeating the exact circumstances of the real shooting. And here's the crazy part. It worked so well that generations of viewers have watched this film without knowing which Eric Draven they are looking at in any given shot. One more thing. The double who carried those scenes, Chad Stahelski, went on to direct John Wick and build one of the biggest action franchises of the century. The movie is about a dead man brought back to finish what he started. That is not a metaphor here. That is the post-production schedule. Bonus fact, the footage no one will ever see the camera was rolling when it happened, and that piece of film became one of the most carefully buried objects in modern Hollywood. The take that killed Brandon Lee existed as physical film. It went to investigators as evidence, because a death on a set is a legal event before it is anything else. What happened to it afterward is described consistently in outline and vaguely in detail. Accounts differ on how much of it was ever processed or viewed, but every credible version ends the same way. It was never released, never leaked, and is reported to have been destroyed. In an era when nothing stays private, that is remarkable. No bootleg. No grainy upload with a fake title. A film industry that monetizes everything looked at that reel and agreed, quietly and permanently, that nobody gets it. The legal echo ran longer. State safety authorities examined the production and cited it over the conditions that led to the death. Lee's mother brought a wrongful death action against the production, and it was resolved out of court rather than in a public trial, which is why the full internal record has never been aired in front of an audience, and the property kept going anyway. A sequel arrived in 1996, a television series followed, and a reboot spent decades in development before finally reaching screens. The franchise got sequels, merchandise, and a remake. The one reel that explains everything got a locked door. So here's the shape of The Crow, a comic drawn to survive one death, adapted into a film that caused another, rescued by the family it hurt most, and finished by pasting a dead man's face onto his best friend's shoulders. Two threads still make it hard to watch. The character loses his wedding, and so did the actor, by 3 weeks. And the story about resurrection had to literally resurrect its lead in an editing suite to reach theaters. Every time somebody calls it the coolest gothic movie of the 90s, they are describing a rescue job. Beautiful, yes, also improvised over a coffin. Which of these facts hit you hardest? The handmade dummy rounds? The missing weapons expert? Or the double who later built John Wick? Tell me below, because the arguments about what was preventable that night are still going on. If you want more buried production truth like this, give this one a like, subscribe to Old Hollywood Classics, and turn on notifications so the next file lands in front of you.